If you've ever lost someone and spent years wondering what really happened, this story is for you. Stay with me because the truth took 15 years to find. November 12, 1989. Carolyn Brenner kissed her husband goodbye at 5 in the morning. Thomas was heading to Miller's Swamp, opening day of deer season. He'd been going to that same spot for 20 years. "You be careful out there," she said, fixing his collar. He smiled, that quiet, gentle smile that made her fall in love with him. "Always am, Carol." She watched his truck disappear down the dirt road, the taillights fading into the Michigan darkness. She made herself coffee, started breakfast, kept glancing at the clock. Thomas always came home by noon, but noon came and went. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3. By 4 o'clock, Carolyn's hands were shaking. By 5, she was on the phone with the sheriff. By 6, there were search teams in the woods. They found his truck at the edge of Miller's Swamp, door wide open, keys in the ignition, his thermos still warm on the dashboard, but no Thomas. No rifle. No footprints leading away. Just gone. Like he'd walked into the fog and never walked back out. For 6 weeks they searched. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers, the National Guard. They drained sections of the swamp, checked every hunting cabin within 50 miles, knocked on doors, asked questions. Carolyn barely slept, barely ate. She stood at the edge of that swamp every single day, calling his name until her voice went raw. "Thomas! Thomas, please!" But the swamp gave nothing back. Sheriff Conway sat her down in her kitchen one cold December morning. "Carolyn, we've done everything we can. We've searched every inch. There's no trace of him." "What does that mean?" Her voice cracked. "He didn't just disappear into thin air."
15 years later. April 2004. Caroline was 61 now. Her hair had gone silver. Her hands trembled when she poured her morning coffee. She was sitting on her porch watching the sunrise when her phone rang. "Mrs. Brenner? This is Deputy Hayes from the Sheriff's Department." Her heart stopped. It always stopped when they called. "We found something in Miller's Swamp. I think you need to come down here." She drove with her hands gripping the wheel so tight her knuckles went white. Beth met her at the swamp, took her mother's hand. "Mom, whatever it is, we'll get through it." Sheriff Conway walked over. He was older now, retired actually, but he'd come out for this. "Caroline." His voice was soft, careful. "What did you find?" He led her to a blue tarp spread out near the water's edge. There, covered in rust and mud and 15 years of swamp water, was a rifle. Thomas's rifle. Caroline's knees buckled. Beth caught her. "That's his," Caroline whispered. "That's his gun." Conway nodded. "We know. Serial number matches. We're sending it to the state lab. See what else we can find." Caroline stared at the weapon that had been in her husband's hands the last morning she saw him. "Does this mean—" "It means we keep looking," Conway said. "After 15 years, we finally have something to work with." The state forensics lab called 2 weeks later. Caroline sat in Sheriff Conway's office, Beth beside her, both holding their breath. The rifle was wedged deep under a fallen cypress, the forensic specialist said over the speakerphone. It was submerged, but the wood stalk preserved some evidence. "What kind of evidence?" Caroline asked. "Blood, human blood, and it's not your husband's." The room went silent. What? Beth whispered. We ran the DNA through the system, got a hit. The blood belongs to a man named Vernon Hitchens. He died in 2001, but back in 1989, he was very much alive. Conway leaned forward. Who was Vernon Hitchens? He had a criminal record, assault, robbery, drug charges, and here's where it gets interesting. In November 1989, he was wanted for questioning in connection with a meth lab operation in Dawson County, about 30 miles from Miller Swamp. Caroline's hands started shaking. I don't understand. What does this have to do with Thomas? The specialist's voice softened. Mrs. Brenner, we think your husband may have witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see, and we think Vernon Hitchens tried to stop him from talking. Within 24 hours, the case exploded back to life. State police, FBI, cold case detectives. They started digging into Vernon Hitchens' history. Turns out, in November 1989, Vernon and his brother Raymond were running a meth lab in an abandoned barn near Miller's Swamp. They were paranoid, violent, armed. And on November 12, 1989, someone reported gunshots near that barn. The report was filed, then forgotten when the...
2 weeks later, they buried Thomas Brenner. The whole town showed up. People who'd searched for him back in 1989. People who'd never stopped wondering. The casket was closed, but it wasn't empty anymore. Caroline stood at the graveside, holding her grandson's hand. Little Thomas was 15 now, old enough to understand, old enough to cry for the grandfather he'd never met. The pastor spoke about love, about faith, about the mystery of life and death, but Caroline barely heard him. She was thinking about the last morning, about the way Thomas had smiled, about the kiss on her forehead, about how she'd wanted to say something important, but the words got stuck. I love you, she whispered now. I always loved you. I never stopped. Beth squeezed her mother's hand, and when they lowered the casket into the ground, Caroline felt something break loose inside of her. Something that had been holding on for 15 years. It wasn't relief. It wasn't peace. It was just release. After the funeral, people came to Caroline's house. They brought food, said kind things, told stories about Thomas. When everyone left, Caroline stood on her porch alone. For the first time in 15 years, she turned off the porch light. She didn't need it anymore. Thomas wasn't coming home. He was already home. In the ground. At rest. But here's what Caroline learned in those 15 years.
Have you ever thought about how ordinary the last moment can be? We always imagine that if we were saying goodbye to someone for the last time, there would be thunder or music or some great sign from the heavens. But usually, it's the smell of coffee. It's the click of a door latch. It's a simple, be careful out there. This is the story of Caroline and Thomas Brenner. But really, it is a story about you and me, and the terrifying, beautiful fragility of the people we hold dear. On November 12th, 1989, the world was normal. Caroline fixed Thomas's collar. Thomas gave her that quiet, gentle smile, the one that had anchored her life for 20 years. He was going hunting in Miller's Swamp, a place he knew better than the back of his hand. He promised he'd be back by noon. But noon is a ghost. Noon came and the driveway remained empty. The sun began to dip, casting long, frantic shadows across the kitchen floor, and silence began to fill the house. Not the peaceful silence of a lazy afternoon, but the heavy, suffocating silence of absence. When they found his truck, the door was open. The keys were in the ignition. His coffee was still warm. but Thomas was gone. Imagine that moment. The moment the timeline of your life snaps in two. There is the before, where life makes sense, and the after, where the person you love vanishes into thin air. For Caroline, there were no footprints, no struggle, just the fog of the swamp swallowing her husband whole. This is where the tension begins. Not just the mystery of where he went, but the agonizing tension of hope. Hope is a cruel thing when it has nowhere to land. Caroline didn't sleep. She stood at the edge of that swamp, screaming his name until her voice was nothing but a raw whisper. She couldn't grieve. How do you grieve a question mark? How do you say goodbye to someone who might still be walking through the woods looking for the way home? Part 2. The long wait in the dark. Time is supposed to heal all wounds. That is the lie we tell ourselves. Time doesn't heal. Time calcifies. Weeks turned into months. The search parties packed up their dogs and their helicopters. The sheriff sat in Caroline's kitchen and told her the swamp doesn't give people back. They wanted her to have a funeral. They wanted her to bury an empty casket just to make everyone else feel comfortable. But Caroline refused, because true love is stubborn. It is illogical. She kept his boots by the door, caked in old mud. She kept his jacket in the closet, preserving the scent of pine and tobacco. And every single night, as the sun went down, she flipped the switch for the porch light. Think about that light. A tiny beacon in the Michigan darkness. For 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. That light wasn't just electricity. It was a refusal to accept the end. It was Caroline saying to the universe, I am still here. I am still his. And if he comes out of that darkness, I will be the first thing he sees. People in town started to pity her. They whispered about the poor woman who couldn't move on. But they didn't understand. Moving on requires a destination. Caroline was stuck in the waiting room of grief. She watched her daughter Beth grow up. She held her grandson, named Thomas, and saw her husband's eyes in a baby's face. She lived a half-life, suspended in the amber of 1989. This is the cost of deep love. When you give your whole heart to someone, you don't get